Set now. So happy Thursday and welcome to today's structured conversation in our voice, maybe assessment, ethics, and other duties as assigned. On behalf of the SAL Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's conversation. We're committed to involve, feature, and represent diverse perspectives and identities in all of our professional development offerings, and ultimately want to meet your needs. So if you want to share your perspectives, have ideas for future topics, please fill out our structured conversation form on our website. I will also post it in the chat shortly. So this month, March 2022, marks 2 years that we've been managing COVID-19. Early on, SAL hosted sessions on the importance of continuing assessment during these uncertain times. And fast forward to today, we're still providing space to discuss how our workloads have shifted and how we're all doing as people and as humans. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about when our ethics have been tested and really just the need to reframe and refocus on assessments. We'll be sharing vulnerable situations as higher ed professionals today. So we appreciate this space to discuss these further in detail. Some of these experiences may trigger some emotions, and we just want to let you all know in advance. So we'll use the chat today to engage with comments, questions, affirmations, etc. As a first-generation student and someone who did not come from an academic background, being presented with some of the higher education political and often borderline ethical situations were some of my biggest surprises as an early professional. And I know early on in my career, the whole fight or flight response was activated. And I often fought just because that's where I come from. I'm not proud of my response in some of those scenarios early on. However, after many years of trial and error, I've learned how to better navigate these challenges. So today, we're going to be hearing from some awesome SAL colleagues on how they've navigated and hear their words of wisdom for responding and handling these scenarios. So let's get started with introductions from our panel. So can you each introduce yourselves and why you chose SAL as an organization? So let's go ahead and get started with Nicole.
Hi, my name is Nicole Wong. I use she, her pronouns, and I am Assistant Vice President for Student Experience and Belonging at the University of Delaware. I'm also a past chair of Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. And I chose SAL as an organization because it really was the home I needed for Student Affairs Assessment. I went into a Student Affairs Assessment Director position, and when I announced that I got the job, someone said, you need to check out this organization. I was like, who are these folks? They said, everything's free, and it's just a really welcoming environment. And I said, okay, sure, I'll check it out. And I just was hooked ever since, and that was 7 years ago. So that's why I chose SAL. And good afternoon and good morning, maybe, depending upon where you are.
Thank you, Nicole. So we'll go ahead and move on to Joe, if you want to introduce yourself and why you chose SAL as an organization.
Yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Joe Levy. I am the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation at National Louis University, which is in Chicago. And for me, SAL was this secret organization that when I worked at Campus Labs, I was a consultant there, and SAL does not allow vendors to be part of the organization. And so I was a member of the Assessed listserv, which does let vendors, but kept here as I would work with my institutions and we talked about assessment, I would keep hearing about Student Affairs Assessment Leaders in the SAL group, but didn't have access to it. So when I left Campus Labs and started working at an institution in 2012, the first thing I did was join SAL. So I've been with them for 10 years. And yeah, I've just really enjoyed the robust information that they share, the collegiality, the openness to sharing information. And I've served on the the External Relations Committee, the Professional Development Committee, where I was also the chair, and I'm the open course manager, and so I serve as an ex officio member of the board now in that capacity.
Thank you, Joe. We'll move on to Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Kruchen. I serve as the Director of Assessment at the University of Colorado-Boulder. I've been in this position for about 5 years, and I apologize. My voice has that conference voice because I just got back from NASPA. So, and I see Leo and Darby, and it was so good to see people. So I apologize. My voice is a little bit strained from that experience, which was so nice to get to see people a little bit more. But I would say that I started in student affairs actually as a student activities professional. And so when I went to grad school and then came back into an assessment specialist role, what was really nice was having Sol as a place to sort of generate ideas, to actually hear from other colleagues what people are doing. So I used it also as a way to understand whether or not I was like, what people were coming up with, what topics were on at the top of mind, and some of those most pressing pieces in our field. And then I was so grateful. I don't think I knew it at the time, but for the professional development committee and some of the trainings that were led, just to get a taste of what was happening. I was very new to assessment, had done some work with CAS and done some work with research, but it's so different from that dimension and lens of student affairs and what we were working on. So I really decided to connect because there's some amazing colleagues. And then I also think it's been mentioned about the listserv, but one of the things that I've really appreciated is that you will always get a response to your question. And that's something, it doesn't come at a cost, it doesn't come at, and people are so willing to share. So those are some of the reasons that I've joined Sol. Thanks, Renée.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. And lastly, Vince, if you want to introduce yourself and why you chose Sol as an organization.
Yeah, thanks, Renée, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Vince Nix, and I'm currently a tenure track assistant professor at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. But prior to that, I spent about 20 years in higher ed administration, and I always wonder how to count those, but it's roughly 13 years in student affairs. I was an RA, a hall director, a community coordinator, assistant dean of students, you name it, an AVP, a VP, and it's just been a constant evolution, right? Growing. And I always say I cut my teeth, my professional higher ed teeth in student affairs and residence life. But outside residence life, I had worked in quality assurance roles. And so ironically, it was my first higher ed professional position outside student affairs. I was asked to be a visiting professor for an organizational performance role. And I was creating a course for evaluation. And I had heard about that Assess listserv, so I subscribed. And I saw a post by Dr. Joe Levy. And at the same time, I was attending an assessment and persistence conference when NASPA used to put those on. And I saw this post. He was asking for materials, putting together that now famous massive online open course for assessment. And I sent him what I was doing. And I'll never forget his reply. He said, thank you, I think. and I was like, oh, I need to learn the vocabulary in this field. And so really, that has been a consistent process for me, and one of the benefits, because I had an assessment evaluation vocabulary that did not make sense to higher education people. And I've learned through Sol how to make myself better understood on those topics anyway. And I think that that Sol MOOC has been immeasurably beneficial to me and the teams that I've supervised. I've had several people and students now who still take the course. And it turns out I've managed to find myself serving as the chair of the Professional Development Committee and serving on the board. So it's an awesome organization, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of it. It keeps me in tune with student affairs, even though I'm not technically doing it now.
Well, we appreciate you all joining us and sharing your stories. So as we get into the storytelling and the importance of this conversation today, our first question will begin with Joe is, how has the pandemic affected your workload or assessment efforts at your institution?
Actually, just writing about this to a student in the open course because they had mentioned that the pandemic for them had prioritized so many other things beyond assessment, and assessment fell to the wayside, and that it caused stress in terms of thinking about what assessment should look like. And I had a different experience at my institution. I should put in the caveat that our institution pre-pandemic we have multiple locations, and we had multiple fully online as well as hybrid programs. So we were using Zoom before Zoom was cool, and the transition to being fully remote, when the pandemic hit, while that was a shift, we were very ready for it because we all were familiar with Zoom, and in a lot of ways had to do this because we had the tools and the technology. So with inclement weather or various things, we'd done it before. So in some ways, it wasn't the biggest shift for us, like I know it was for some other institutions. But specifically with assessment, what I appreciated, certainly there was some added stress and some initial panic, but what I really appreciated and that I've been trying to maintain is it brought about a focus and a simplification and recentering on what student learning is and what's intended. Because I think at the time, there was panic of, oh my gosh, like there was going to be this in-person event or this in-person observation, or I was planning this big elaborate test, and now we can't do that anymore. So what do we do? Do we just not do assessment? Which said, no, we still need to be looking at student learning, especially now more than ever, because we're trying things. We need to see if they're effective. But what I appreciated about it is it opened the door for some really meaningful conversations with faculty and staff of what are you really hoping students walk away with, from this class, from this experience, from this interaction. And given what that is, let's then think of realistic and appropriate measurements in our current environment. But I think in a lot of ways, we take for granted existing student learning outcomes, or especially if there's been turnover in the office, or you're new to an office and you're sort of tasked with leading a certain program or initiative, you just take for granted or assume that everything there is fine and appropriate. And so what I appreciated about the pandemic was that it forced us to pause and really reevaluate and make sure that the learning we're expecting here is appropriate and intended, right? And intentional. So I think sometimes, I talk about that with people that are doing like outcome mapping, that people can get map happy and think that their program or their service does everything for everyone. And but what was it truly intended to do? Not just what happened to be there, what learning was present, but what was it intending to help in terms of student behavior? And so that's one of the things that I appreciated and helped keep me positive and motivated through everything, because I really enjoyed those conversations, and so did the faculty and staff, because it got them, it renewed an excitement and enthusiasm for them of truly their purpose in working with the student, and keeping that then as the focus instead of the modality or trying to force a certain intervention or process to work. Yeah, I'll stop there.
That sounds so positive. Like, I love that reframing to like, we're a higher ed institution. We're here for student learning, growth, and development. And I love that you were able to reframe that and get back to the importance of that. So moving on to Vince, how has the pandemic affected your workload or assessment efforts at your institution?
Thank you, Renee. I think it's fascinating to hear Dr. Levy talk, because we didn't talk about what we were going to say beforehand, but some of what he said fits into what I had prepared to say. So my workload didn't change as a direct result, because I work in a wholly online educational leadership doctoral program. We were already doing that. However, there are two, I think, pretty big indirect consequences that I'll talk about. First, we've seen, and as Joe mentioned, the prioritization, we've seen that our doctoral students have been pulled in so many different directions that it's tough to keep their doctoral degree plans prioritized. And I'm not judging them. I also ranked my family ahead of my degree. I was ABD for 7 years, right? So this is not me saying something's wrong with that, but more than not, I'm seeing that. And so 87% of our doctoral cohort work in PK-12, secondary education. And many are already in C-level roles. They were not already online to the extent required. And so this has been and continues to be a really trying ordeal for them and their organizations. And the ability to keep up with the feverish pace of an online doctoral program has been somewhat reduced. And as a dissertation chair, I've had to extend studies for students who had hoped to graduate sooner, but were unable to prioritize their research projects. And those decisions and conversations have not been in every single case pleasurable, right? We have to reframe those things. And then secondly, as we as a faculty here have been asked to do more of the assessment work in our department. So in the past, we had maybe an administrative person or two who transferred our data from the learning management system to the learning outcomes assessment software. And now we're all, as faculty, being asked to create logins for our platform and learn it on our own time. And so we formed an assessment committee, and I was selected as the one of the co-chairs. But all this is volunteer, right? We don't get reductions in our teaching load. And I'm not great at turning people down. If I see something that needs to be done, I try to do it. My partner tells me often, if you care so much, you carry too much. It's hard for me to get that ingrained in my head, but the work has to be done. And I almost know how to do it. And one of the things we're doing in that committee work, going back to what Dr. Levy talked about, is we have decided to look at the one most important learning outcome for each course and make sure that we are intentional about crafting a way to get that across with all of this other complexity stuff going on, making sure we prioritize one in every course and that those are sequentially making sense to the students so they can see what they're doing, because they're really, this is becoming less and less of a priority. Thanks.
Thank you. I love how you all are just recentering back on like making it much more aligned and making it more synergistic. I think that's helpful for everyone. So moving on to Kim, how has the pandemic affected your workload or assessment efforts on your campus?
Yeah, I was thinking, I really appreciate this question, Renée, and I'm super curious if others have this experience. One of the struggles that we had is that our unit of really 2.5 people is responsible for helping to support more than 30 plus units in the division. And those units really span all types of experiences, right? So of course we have our student support office and CAPS and all the way to dining. And so what we did during especially the pandemic was, I think in a very similar way to Vince and to Joe, we actually tried to like streamline and really focus on what was kind of a priority, and also to be able to talk about what's the value added to student affairs. Renée, I totally agree. Most of us probably have that experience of calling our offices small but mighty, because they're so mighty. And so to frame that, one of the pieces that we did, especially in the fall of 2020, was to actually ask every unit to use this strategy map that we developed to focus on 4 things. The first one was really the quality that our students were gaining, right? So we knew that there was going to be a lot of differences between, we have a traditional residential campus that really thrived on in-person experiences, both activities, tutoring, other types of opportunities. And so we really wanted to make sure that what did the quality look like, right? What were some of those indicators that were really important and critical? And how did that look different during the pandemic? So that's something that we've really tracked. One is quality. The second one is access to opportunities. I don't know about you all, but in full transparency, our students they had the same maybe level of access, which is what we were trying to make sure that they did, but whether they took that next step and that opportunity to really engage was really hard for them. I could not imagine having gone to college during a pandemic and doing all your things in kind of your room and what that looked like. So we really did want to make sure that access was at the forefront of the work that we did. 2 other things that we really focused on was the long-term impact, for our students. I don't know about all of you, but when we first started talking about COVID and the pandemic, I've never been through a pandemic. So our office really started talking a little bit about like, oh my gosh, maybe 2 weeks like working from home will be like kind of nice to like reset and to like get that experience right. And then 2 years later, we're still working from home and doing some of that stuff. But the third piece that was really critically important to us is that we knew the student experience would be different. It has been, and students, while they might have access, maybe aren't looking at some of those things. So the other part that we really wanted to understand is what was the long-term impact? Maybe they didn't get to get as involved this past year, but what did we need to keep doing in order to make that successful in subsequent years when maybe hopefully they could have more access and more opportunity to do some of those things. And then the last one was really that we wanted to look at trends and forecasting. So Joe, absolutely right. Like, I think we're all kind of in that, maybe hopeful. I'm going to call it hopeful that it was going to go away really quickly, right? But it didn't. And so we needed to understand what were some of the trends that we were going to start to see. I could imagine a lot of us have started to see our students. Mental health, of course, is a huge piece of that. But we have some information that we're starting to look at that's talking about this decreased opportunity for growth and development for our students, especially in that first year experience. So we knew that those were going to start becoming really important. So we wanted to look at, again, some of those trends, but then also where could we go? This was a whole new opportunity, right? So we created a lot of reporting and a lot of opportunities to ask our units to think a little bit about what do students need? We know this is very challenging and hard and shifting every day, but what is it that we can kind of continue to help and to evaluate? So we did a lot of grab and go activities and some of those pieces, which I thought was really valuable to us. So the other part that I wanted to address is that reporting, I think from an assessment lens, became very different. The end of year reports that people are maybe familiar with submitting needed to look a little bit different. So we really kind of narrowed in on what it was that we could actually continue to look at and hit on kind of those 4 areas of importance for us. And then we did something new this year, which was that Leo and others have kind of heard a little bit about, was that we actually asked people to write a short 1,500 word article that would go in this magazine that talked about the differences and kind of what we were able to still provide to our students. The narrative piece of that was so critical as we were kind of coming out of the pandemic. In the pandemic, we didn't have the same numbers of engagement, but what types of things could we provide to students? So that was really an interesting piece of it too. So really we focused on those 4 things, and then reporting looked a little bit different as well. Happy to answer more questions if people have them about that.
No, that's so important that I think you bring up the impact on residential campuses, right? Because student engagement for so long has been like tracking numbers when students show up, and like in this hybrid/virtual world, and even bringing students back on campus, but yet still kind of in this hybrid mode for a while, is like, how do you track when they log into like an Instagram live, like of streaming? Like, how do you track engagement in that way? And so I appreciate you bringing that up. So moving on to our last panelist and to hear your awesome perspectives, how has the pandemic affected your workload or assessment efforts at your institution, Nicole?
Yeah, I can certainly relate to a lot of what our colleagues here have already touched on, and a few other things I'd like to offer. And thinking about my work on my campus and how some things have changed were, we pay attention to trend data, but I feel like it's even more important, where I feel like sometimes with pandemic, there was kind of almost like a dismissal of, well, we need to look at any sort of fall 2020 data point or spring 2021, almost in a dismissive way. But I think it's actually really important not to do that. Especially, I think even at the time, there was not necessarily the understanding that the pandemic would be going on for years, that it was like a one-time, like a 1-year event maybe, and it's not. So I think that seeing the importance of trend data is really important now to look at kind of that rebound, or will we ever rebound in certain metrics? I think for an example of this is on our campus, we have really robust data that we have tracked over the at least past 7 years related to our extended orientation and welcome experiences, and seeing how our metrics for some key indicators have really shifted as a result of the pandemic, and they're rebounding, but not necessarily, maybe is in a more pronounced way as what we might anticipate. And we have to ask ourselves some questions: is this okay? And we also shouldn't be overly alarmed or shocked too. Certainly a virtual welcome experience will never be what the in-person welcome experience would be in terms of even student expectations or even our expectations for what can be accomplished. So I have found that the trend data is still exceptionally important now. Another effect, I would say, there's a couple other things I want to touch on. They're a little bit different from one another. One is just the importance of how relevancy of data became really important. So there was this complete, just stop everything, when the pandemic started on everything that we were doing. We're engaging in some outcomes development work for departments in our division, and that came to a screeching halt. That was not the priority. The priority was, health and safety of students, which needed to happen. But with that meant that, we were now collecting a lot of data about student experiences in the pandemic, their access to various services or resources, and even access to programs that we offer on campus. So, and that demand was not even just within our division, but it really came from other campus partners. And like most places, a very small and mighty office as myself, and we have a part-time professional as well. And we have also a committee too, which became really important to engage our assessment council to help actually make some of these assessment projects related to COVID even happen. And so that was very, very helpful. And I think that also relates to something else I'll touch on in a second as well. But really focusing on what is the data du jour. It was around COVID and the experiences, but also coupled with that at the same time were the experiences around race and racism in our country. And that was also a very timely issue, not that it's never timely, but it was something that was a national issue at the time too. So there was also a pivoting to, we need to be paying attention to that as well. So it was definitely, I think, made the work shift quite a bit from what the plan was, and that was okay. And we needed to make room for that. And also to sustain, how do we continue saving room for when the unexpected happens, for us to be able to pivot in the assessment world. But I think one of the things that was kind of nice in thinking about this virtual space was we were able to capitalize off of it in ways we hadn't. And one was paying more attention to the metadata, kind of the constant data tracking when students are engaging virtually that we typically would not have been able to pay attention to before, in terms of their engagement of not just showing up, but how long are you actually here? What are you clicking on? We started to ask more of these kinds of questions. For example, we moved our orientation to an online format. Well, now the question is, where are the students going when they get to the Canvas site, and how long are they staying there? A lot of the same questions that faculty might be asking in their courses, we needed to ask also in student affairs. Similarly, the virtual environment also allowed us to capitalize off these opportunities to come together, even as a division, more easily, where we're coming together. Well, and I said to myself, this is a great opportunity to ensure that assessment information can get in front of people. So, we hosted more lunch and learns than we would have ever done. We also were able to include in our divisional town halls, which were biweekly and then move monthly, of having assessment being a part of that and sharing out on various assessment activity. And actually seeing, 100+ people being engaged in that content, that would have never happened if we weren't coming together on Zoom. So it's kind of like, meet people where they are. Like, I'm going to force this upon you, but I don't think it felt probably forced, like, from the people on the receiving end of it, because it was always presented in a way that was engaging and accessible for everyone in our division. And I think now we're at that point where we're trying to return to some normalcy of like a rhythm in terms of, with that outcomes work, we were kind of plugging along. It's just taking a lot longer for us to do some of that work. But we're getting there. And I think we're now at that point where it's like, okay, we're getting back to some of the basics of, getting back into more routines related to assessment training and so forth. And it's taken some time. And this unfortunately we cannot hurry the pandemic along.
Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate you bringing up all that happened in 2020. We've been categorizing that as the 2020 syndrome because there was a lot that happened, not just the pandemic, but the equity, the racism. And then in the Pacific Northwest, we had a lot of wildfires, which decimated a lot of our community. And so it was a rough year. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I think it'll be interesting long-term to see, now that we're kind of in this endemic state, like what practices did we start during the pandemic that we're going to keep versus how many of us are just going to regress back to pre-pandemic. So I think it's just going to be interesting in higher ed in its totality to kind of make those observations. So I appreciate you all sharing how your campuses have adjusted and changed during the last 2 years. So now we're going to move on to where I think is a really deep question, but I also think one that's going to provide a lot of strategies and how to navigate the challenges we all experience in higher ed. So we'll start with Vince, but first, can you please describe a scenario in which your ethics have been tested or in which you've had to navigate higher ed politics?
Thank you. And I want to echo Dr. Long. I really appreciated you focusing on the metadata, and I might just want to thank you for that. So yeah, I'll talk about something with accreditation. It's probably the most recent one in my head that challenged me to that extent. So this was the last time I was over writing an accreditation report, and it was in SAC COC. And it was in 17-18 before the principles changed over. So 4.5 was still there, and it was about student complaints. And so I was over a portfolio that included a student help desk, and that's who took all of student complaints. And so for that principle, so just briefly, the principle says that we have adequate procedures for addressing student complaints, and that we demonstrate that we follow those procedures when resolving student complaints. And so we created a report. We had data from phone records, transcriptions, student information system notes, and our divisional team had put together, I thought was a pretty neat report. And we demonstrated that we improved this. Now, this was our 10-year reaffirmation report, and we had written up the response to that principle. And in cabinet, the CEO of the institution asked me why we had included issues that had not surfaced to the level of professional legal involvement. And he wanted everything taken out because we had not had a court case with any students since the last time we filed the 5-year report. So I shouldn't put anything in there that didn't rise to that level. And so one of our findings, though, in that 5th-year report was that we did not keep good records of student complaints. And so our report was geared to show that we had indeed changed, and we were actually keeping up with them, and we were managing and having dialogue with students as these things happen, and they were getting cut off. We didn't need to have those legal kinds of hiccups. And so as I was explaining the rationale and what my interpretation of the 4.5 was, the CEO pounded, we were in a big conference room with a huge wooden table, pounded both fists on the table and screamed, I mean, loudly, "Shut up." Really strong voice. "Do it as I say." And I was standing right and showing some slides, and I'm right now, I'm having, you said it was going to be triggering. I didn't think it was going to trigger me though. I'm having flashbacks and the hair on my neck is standing up right now. But I stood there and I've never had in a professional setting that sort of response from anyone in my entire career. And so I just took some really deep breaths, and as calmly as I could, I said, "You didn't hire me and you don't pay me to shut up, but I will not engage in further conversation in this unprofessional manner." And I sat down at the end of the table, looking all the way down from him, and just breathed really deeply and counted 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. And when I said 3 in my head, I asked, "May I continue?" And he said, "You got 1 minute." And he let me talk for 1 minute without interruption. And I don't think I maintained my professionalism. Okay. My heart was racing. My voice was shaking. I know it was trembling in anger if it wasn't shaking in fear. I was upset, but he gave me 1 minute. So I had to stand there and talk about why this was important and condense it without details, which is so difficult for me, as you are all experiencing. But we kept the report as our division team had written it. I did maintain my ethical stance, even though maybe some professional things went out the window, but there were 0 findings. So we were vindicated, right? It was a perfect report. But I think what this illustrates, and I still see this happening occasionally, some of the top level people maybe you haven't done those kinds of things. And I think this is why organizational empathy is in such short supply right now. But I don't see accreditors out to get us. Maybe they were years ago, but they just want us to demonstrate that we have specific metrics that we use to continuously improve. And it doesn't mean we have to be perfect in everything. And I just think that's a message sometimes that we forget about. It's not about being perfect. It's about learning how to be better than we were yesterday. And we don't have to compare ourselves to others. It's how we can be better to what we were yesterday. I'll stop.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. You handled that better than I likely would have handled it. So I appreciate you sharing your experience with this. So we'll move on to Nicole, describing a scenario where your ethics or you've had to navigate politics.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reflecting on the question, I think I've been very fortunate in my experience to not feel like I've had a lot of pitfalls or anything compared to some colleagues that I've heard. But one thing I will say is I think the one area of exploration that has required the most political savviness to navigate as particularly around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've found. I think that in higher ed, many of us, we say these are, we have these values related to DEI and so forth. And then it's like, well, wait, you want to collect information and you actually want to talk more about what the issues are and with evidence. And it's like, yes, I do. We actually have a project that we recently have worked on, and it's something that it was quite public in terms of exploring a social media account that was created, by presumably students, and to do some assessment around that and explore and analyze what we're seeing on these posts. And to do that, I brought it up and I said, I think we need to do something with this. This is just out there. And I feel like we have a responsibility to look at it and in a meaningful way, not just, oh, can you believe this is what's on here today? But we really need to, how can we not just see what's out there, but how can we learn from what's out there? And it was a very different way for us to look at issues of, campus climate and culture without asking a question. We're observing, essentially. Because I often feel like when we start asking the questions, we've already put some boundaries and limitations on what it is we're actually willing to learn. Like let someone else tell us what their experiences are rather than us asking. And in order to do that, it did require, I said I have this idea, and the idea was definitely not necessarily well received by some folks, but it wasn't necessarily the people who, their opinions matter, but it wasn't so much that they were the gatekeepers necessarily. And, but before venturing on, it's certainly something that I talked through, with another senior administrator to say, is this something, this is the plan, and this is why this is important. Is this something that would have support? Now, thankfully, I got a yes. And, when I think about this question, I'm like, well, what would my response been if the answer was no? I think I still probably would have looked at it. Maybe it just wasn't going to be shared. Probably wouldn't have engaged as many people in the process. But it was definitely something that was championed and continues to be championed. So I think it was very fortunate, but I do know that I feel like that is one area, as much as we say in higher education that we care and this matters, regardless of what campus I've been at, it does always feel like an area that when you want to look under the hood a little too long or at all, or put something under the microscope, that then people tend to get a little nervous because once you start looking, then folks are expecting a response and for you to actually attend to what you're finding.
Oh my gosh, Nicole, that's such a good segue into, because there's like, I love that. I think that it's such a good point of like, what are you doing? Like, if you look for too long, you're going to find some things. And we oftentimes say like, we have like data, we've like collected it, and then that leads to more questions that we have. So I really appreciate that for sure. And I was thinking a lot about, we all have like different things that will come up in our time. So I can think about an associate vice chancellor that asked me for some data that was related to something else that they didn't necessarily have the purview of. And I think my concluding thought is that information and the information that we all collect for our divisions is power, and that comes with some really intentionality. And so I was going to actually suggest potentially a few strategies that I've used, at least in this last year, to think a little bit about how have I overcome and navigated some of these politics. And so a few things that I've thought a lot about is that I think because of the expansion of assessment and student affairs and the work that we all are doing has actually provided us an opportunity to look at different types of metrics. And so I think that a few years ago, it was all about utilization, right? It was all like how many people are coming. And I think that that's still really important. But I think that we've started to be able to transition into utilization is really important, and what is their experience, right? So what are the outcomes that are being achieved with that? And so one of my suggestions would be to actually look at a variety of metrics and to actually provide that as sort of this rich narrative that we can actually use to talk about and to navigate some of those really sticky political situations that I think we can all find ourselves in. One of the other pieces that we've actually been able to do, I think, because of the pandemic and some of the structure that was kind of lost because of the pandemic, is that we've actually been able to start comparing a lot of longitudinal data. I think this is also a result of just the growth in our field as assessment professionals and student affairs. So we're actually really able to start looking at a lot of that longitudinal data. And that's a way that I've actually been able to navigate those political situations, is saying, during the pandemic, it was really, really hard. However, at this point now, we're actually starting to see some improvement. So we're able to talk about that and differentiate that, and I think in a different way. So belonging, as an example, we've seen belonging be really high for most of our students as they come. During the 2020 last year, the academic year, it was very low. It was very hard to see some of those things. And now we've started to see that creep back up. And I've been very clear and honest with our leadership and student affairs that it was bad, but it's getting better is usually what I say, right? So thinking about how you're kind of hooking some of that information. And then the last strategy that I would suggest is that we've really focused on creating kind of this learning environment. And we've done that through both our assessment liaison model, but also kind of opening up our trainings. And we talk about a wide variety of things. But this has really helped us to, I think, take down that curtain of scariness that I think sometimes exists when people are talking about assessment and being worried that you don't know enough. So I've actually really gone out and have tried to like empower everyone in our division to feel like they can have conversations about assessment and how to elevate that. Joe, I think it's your turn.
Yeah. So many good stories and thoughts shared. To build off of what Nicole said, I've had some examples where so in my role, I oversee all assessments, so academic affairs as well as student affairs, and I'm also overseeing our academic program review process. And I'm regularly going to our provost and vice provost to share with them data that we never really look at before. When we talk about persistence, retention, graduation rates, the institution never disaggregates those. Or if they do, they only do it at the program level. And so they give that information to a specific program, which is good for the program, I guess, but they're never looking at it, say, at a college level, which we have 6 colleges, or at the university level, to look for trends across the institution. Because by doing what they're doing, it becomes very easy to then excuse it away as, oh, well, that's just a problem in that program, right? And, you know, I'll never forget the previous boss, but standing in their office, and I had done my own analysis with all the data. So I was like, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to do it and share it. And, you know, they were telling me that I shouldn't push so hard on this, and that, you know, in their experience working at which, mind you, at this time, they had worked in their career at 2 other institutions, which, not to knock anyone who like is at only a couple institutions in their career, whereas I had worked at this time at 5 other institutions, not to mention consulted for over 100 of them. So they were like, listen, my experience with other institutions, we're doing way more than them. So we don't need to do any of the stuff you're talking about or push further on this. We're doing enough. I said, well, the numbers would say otherwise. I said, it's not about looking to your neighbor or competitor and thinking, well, we're doing more than them, so we must be doing all right. We have to ground ourselves in our institution, the needs of our students, and those were not being met. And I had the data to back it up. But yeah, I was essentially told, like, maybe we can start working that in the future, but let's not keep pushing that now. The good news in that story is that was 2.5 years ago, and now some of those disaggregated metrics are much more standard, because I didn't stop fighting for those things. But the most recent instance was I worked with, we produced for the first time ever, a student affairs division report. And I was so excited because I had the aggregated data aligned to our brand new division student learning outcomes, and also aligned to our university learning outcomes. And our president ended up cutting the divisional data overview because it wasn't as positive in their opinion as what it should have been, which makes no sense with how they left the report, because the way the report was structured, like we did some introduction, because there were other things beyond assessment in there, but we talked a couple pages about like the intentional alignment of each area to these divisional outcomes and even to the university outcomes. And then you skip to the assessment section and it just talks about the university outcomes and then doesn't say anything about the divisional outcomes. I was like, so anyone who's reading this is going to go, wait a minute, what? This doesn't make any sense. Why'd they go on and on about this? And, yeah. And, you know, when the president says you can't put that in a report, yeah, somewhat my hands are tied. Although what I have done is I have been including that data in any of my presentations, both internal and external, to share those results. But yeah, the official report no longer has them, but I still retained like that full version, and I share it all the time, but was prohibited from putting it on our institutional website. So yeah, those are some of the examples I've run up against on this topic. And I think it's a lot. I think what's nice about assessment and accreditation is that you're in a space where at least you have some data to back you up. I think it's a lot harder when you're in a space dealing with some of these unethical situations, and it can be very much one person's professional opinion versus another. But it really helps to have some professional allies, and even within your institution, to back you up and support you and amplify your voice and bring up the ideas. You know, that's something else that I really appreciate too, is having student affairs and faculty members who will voice something, so that it's not just, oh, Joe has this crazy idea again, or Joe keeps banging his drum, but instead, like, no, this is coming from the faculty, this is coming from the staff. They want to see this. They think this data is important.
No, I appreciate you sharing that, Joe. And I appreciate every single one of you sharing these really tough scenarios of dealing with ethics and political situations. And we could do a whole series on this. I don't feel like there's enough time in the time that we have today to share all the many different stories. And the whole purpose and impetus behind the structured conversation is to really ultimately say, at the end of the day, like, we have to be assessment and accreditation and higher ed like rock stars. We have to like know all these things, and yet we have to like navigate this. So I want to use the final 6 minutes to hear from our panelists. Any just kind of final words of wisdom that you have as anyone in higher ed today who's either doing student affairs or academic assessment, or just anyone in this general place. So we'll start with, we'll go to Nicole first and get your thoughts, words of wisdom.
I think Joe really teed me up for this, is finding your champions in this work. They may not necessarily be your supervisor or whoever. I'm really fortunate to have a supervisor that really champions the work that I do and sees the value in it. But, you know, your champions, but also I say on our campus all the time, you can't do assessment in a vacuum, and it's important to engage others. And I would say that continuously finding ways to engage other people in the work that's meaningful to them, that's mutually beneficial, not for just me as someone who was, you know, overseeing assessment for the division, but also not just how it benefits me, but how does it really benefit you and then the students ultimately. And I feel like we have been able to, I've seen such a difference in our culture as an institution or as a division on seeing people really engaged in the work very differently over the past 7 years. So I would definitely say that, like, you really need a community in doing this work.
We'll go on to Vince. Any words of wisdom you have for us?
Yeah, well, I'm going to echo some wisdom from a couple of people too. Dr. Long about the metadata, and I also think qualitative data is probably more important now than it's ever been. Dr. Kruchen brought that up earlier, but we've seen from our qualitative reflections that the women are doing completely different restorative work than the men are. The women are rebuilding their homes with the kids at home, the men are rebuilding the organizations. Even though the women also run organizations, they're still responsible for doing it at home. And so we don't really have a system in place to recognize that, but we need to look at qualitative data to look at that. And then, but there's a line from a song that I really like. It says, I have no lies or truth in what I say. There's no meaning. And as a data professional, I always try to remember that line, because my job is to present the data. The meaning comes from the people who look at it. As we've heard everybody say so many times today, sometimes they're going to read into it what they want, whether that's what it says or not. Our job is to present the data as they say. And most of the time in my career, I've not been at the pay grade to make those decisions. Occasionally I have. So I have to keep that kind of middle ground. And I will say, keeping that has sort of developed a reputation for people, for me, with people. A lot of people say, if you don't want to know the truth, don't ask Vince. And I'm okay with that being said about me, right? And so I just, the third thing that I thought about while we're all talking is normalizing mental health. Because I wouldn't have, I mean, saw some comments. Thank you for the feedback, because I was a little bit nervous about sharing what I shared. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have a mental health professional that I talked to, right? I was raised a fighter, as Renee said earlier. My instinct is not to do that. It's because I was helped along the way.
Those are some great points, Vince and Darby. Absolutely, it seems like absolutely like assessment is a team sport. So I love that. And then I would just add that I think that what I've tried to do, especially for folks who are doing assessment in the division, but in other functional units, is to make it easy and to make it streamlined. So for us, we've created a lot of structure. I think that's something that assessment folks are oftentimes really known for, whether your plan A is in your title or other things, is making meaning out of really like muddy, ambiguous pieces, is helping people to find structure in that. So what we've done, and the only piece that I would add, is really being very clear with folks who you're relying on to help with assessment, creating strategy maps, or creating, just saying, I don't need a whole plan from you. I just need what your 2 to 3 priorities are for this semester, and helping them to document it in that way. So that's the piece I would add.
And I'd just say, don't underestimate and don't forget to focus on recognizing the humanity in one another and building a relationship, because that pays off in dividends in terms of building those allies, building those collaborators. And even if, I have plenty of people who they'll moan and groan and, complain about assessment, and they're not assessment fans, but they're Joe fans, right? And so then, they're willing to engage, they're willing to do the work, and they're willing to speak up about important issues that we've talked about.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our stories. This recording will be shared via the listserv, and then I'll make sure I share the summaries of the words of wisdom for you all as well. And with that, you all enjoy the rest of your Thursday, and I hope you have a great one. Thank you so much for joining us today.